Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Model Building. In the last episode, I introduced my project to build 5 diesels I saw in the front of a Southern Pacific freight train in 1993. I talked about the prototype and my plans for what I wanted to do with each of the models. I also started to take some of the models apart and put them in containers to store them. In this episode, I'm going to focus on Cotton Belt 7787, the B30-7. As I mentioned last time, for this project I'm using an Atlas HO scale B30-7. It was already factory painted for Cotton Belt, and my first idea was just to take off the original numbers and renumber it. However, that proved to be unworkable. Also, after studying the photos, I realized that some of the details had to be changed anyway, so I might as well just repaint it. My goals are to remove a few more parts, strip the paint from the shell, and remove some unwanted detail to make room for new details. Before I start stripping the paint, I have to remove just a couple more parts. The radiator area has a plastic frame and a photo-etched grill. To remove it, I need to release 6 tabs inside the shell. Don't try to just pull the radiator assembly off, as the parts are very fragile and easily damaged. The rear of the engine has the wrong headlight casting, and though the number boards look okay, I have some aftermarket parts that look better. I also need to remove and plate over the class lights. Because of all that, I'm going to remove the factory grab irons. Removing the window glass from the cab is a little tricky. The side and rear windows are all one piece, and this needs to be removed first. I'll start by working on one side. I'll pry it from the inside first, then work it carefully from the outside. This is another fragile part that can be damaged if this isn't done carefully, so it pays to take your time. Eventually it'll come out. Once that's all done, the front windows can be removed. Oops, it looks like one of the rear windows broke off. That's okay though, since the break is in an area that won't show. I'll work the window out with a screwdriver. In front, I'll remove the small wire grab under the headlight. The grabs on top of the short hood are plastic. On some Atlas models, these are too thick in cross-section, but on this model they look okay, so I'll save them. The brake wheel can be pried off with a small screwdriver. Since the parts are fragile and all of this is going to end up being painted the same color, I've decided not to remove the uncoupling levers and air hoses. If the hoses end up breaking later, I can replace them, but I'm hoping to save the uncoupling levers. Now I can start soaking the shell, sill, and cab in paint remover. For anything but Kato shells, I use Scale Coat Wash Away Paint Remover. It's a little pricey, but it can be reused any number of times. I keep some in this mason jar. Even if it looks dirty, it'll still work. I'll start by putting the Atlas shell into the jar. As you can see, I have to soak each end separately as I can't quite fit the entire thing in there. So through the magic of television, it's been about 15 minutes. I always wear gloves when handling paint stripper, as it can irritate your skin. As you can see, with some help from an old toothbrush, the paint is coming off pretty easily. Note how the lettering is tougher than the paint. No wonder I didn't have any luck trying to take off just the numbers. After another 15 minutes or so, and with some scrubbing, the lettering is gone. It's important to get rid of all of it, as the lettering has thickness and will show through any paint that's put over it later. It takes a little more time to get rid of the red, as the paint is thicker in those areas. Though it's a little tedious, so far this is working really well. Now that the paint is off, I'll rinse the model in water to get rid of any residue from the paint stripper. I tied a piece of scrap wire to the cab to keep from losing it in the bottom of the jar. Otherwise, stripping the paint from this part will be the same as for the shell. Now all the parts are stripped. As you can see, there are some darker stains in areas, especially on the cab roof. That's okay though. Stripped parts are never going to look as pristine as brand new undecorated plastic. None of this will show when the model is repainted. There are still traces of the original numbers on the cab sides. Again, this will get covered by new paint. Even though I can't feel any texture from the numbers, I'm giving the cab sides a light sanding with some 600 grit paper just to be safe. The main thing is to make sure that the old numbers don't have any thickness that could show through the new paint. As I mentioned earlier, when comparing my photos to the model, I could see that the headlight casting on the rear of 7787 is the wrong type. The cast-in number boards look okay, but I think the aftermarket ones look better. The Details West parts are white metal castings and they aren't lightable, but since they were painted over on the real engine, that doesn't really matter. I'll start by poking out the old number board inserts. I'm using a number 17 chisel blade to remove the old details. The trick here is to go slow and shave little bits at a time so as not to damage the shell. Also, I'm using a fresh blade, as dull blades have a tendency to get stuck and then jump, which can be dangerous. I always try to stay conscious of safety when using tools. I also need to remove the cast-in class lights, as these were plated over on the real engine. Now I can finish up with some sandpaper. I'm using a scrap piece of 040 styrene as a makeshift sanding block, wrapped with a small piece of 320 grit paper. While sanding, I'm trying to keep the sharp separations between the various planes on the rear of the hood, where there are bends in the sheet metal on the real engine. Using a sanding block helps a lot here. Unfortunately, I couldn't figure a way to do this without removing the nut and bolt detail around the uppermost grab iron holes. I'll restore those later with aftermarket nut bolt washer castings. In spite of my best efforts, I managed to nick the shell with the blade. A little squadron green putty will fix this. I'll put some on and set it aside to dry. It's important to fix this damage now, as once I start putting on new details, it'll be harder to sand. While the back is drying, I'll work on the front. I need to remove the class lights from the short hood. After sanding the area with 320 grit paper, I switched to 400. For models like this one that don't have a metallic finish, that's usually as far as I need to go. While I'm at it, I'm going to get rid of the small mold seam along the edges of the hood. The cab headlight also has to go. I have to be careful not to damage the front number boards, which I want to keep. Now that the putty in the back is dry, I can sand it with 320 grit, followed by 400. One thing I've learned is not to assume that I'm done just because I puttied and sanded something. This is to me a fine surface primer. It's the same white I'll eventually use on the entire model, but for now I'm just going to spray a little on the puttied area. The paint makes it easier to see any defects that might need more putty and sanding. I've checked it from a variety of angles and I can't see anything, so now I'll call it done. The last step is to lightly sand the temporary primer with some 400 grit paper. .77-87 shell is now ready for additional detailing. I didn't strip the paint from the radiator section, as these parts are very fragile and they're going to be the same dark gray anyway. I mentioned earlier that I don't use washaway on Kato shells. This is a Kato SD45 shell, not one of the ones I'll be using for the two SP SD45Rs in this project. Soaking it in washaway made the shell brittle and eroded some of the surface detail. A couple of cracks also appeared. I glued the cracks and hopefully the shell will be salvageable, but something about the plastic that Kato uses doesn't react well to chemicals. To strip paint from a Kato shell, I prefer to use a hobby sandblasting gun like this one. It shoots aluminum oxide particles at the model and removes the paint without harming the plastic. It takes a while and is messy, but it does work. Sandblasting will work on any brand of model, and it has the added benefit of leaving a matte finish on the plastic that takes paint really well. I don't recommend using other weird chemicals to strip paint from any plastic model, with the possible exception of isopropyl alcohol. I've heard all kinds of things on the internet about brake fluid, oven cleaner, and other things, but in my experience it pays to use something that's specifically made for hobby use. It took about 1.5 bottles of washaway to fill this jar, and it looks really dirty, but as I said before, I can keep reusing this for a long, long time. I think it's a worthwhile investment. I'm going to stop it there for now, and next time I'll come back and work on the two SP SD45Rs and the Conrail SD40. Thanks for watching.